Hello and welcome to Mental Health. It's a Trap. We're your hosts, Susan and Stephen, mother and son, unraveling the complexities of the mental health traps people fall in. Join us on this podcast journey as we demystify the mental health labyrinth, explore common issues, and provide you with tools to navigate this sometimes extremely daunting terrain. You can expect engaging conversations, personal stories, and probably also have a laugh or two. Access to mental health care should not be what causes you additional stress. We invite you to follow along, and together we can embrace the darkness. Hello and welcome back to our next episode. For anyone listening, this can be something that causes, I'll call it an emotional reaction, depending on your experiences. So this is going to be more trauma-informed, and so we are going to be talking more specifically about depression, and a newer term that's been being used is unaliving, or when people either don't want to be here anymore, if they could sleep and not wake up. And so those are some of the euphemisms that people might say that other people in their lives might not necessarily catch on because they're very vague. And so when someone is saying things like, I give up, I can't do this anymore, sometimes, they're frustrated at work, or there might be issues in their relationships and they're just done. And then there might be times where it might be something that's a little bit more deeper. And so that's the topic of what we're going to talk about today. So if it is too much, I would encourage you to either have someone to call, or to not listen to the episode, or to be in a space where you can be ready for reactions that you have in your body. We talked about somatic breath work and the CRS model, and just different ways that people can cope to help with their emotional regulation, because sometimes our brains can take over our bodies and can put us in stress. And, we want to make sure that we have a helpful discussion for people who might have loved ones, family or friends in their lives that might have depression or might not want to be here anymore. And so, again, that's what this is going to be. And I'm trying to make this a little bit longer of an explanation, just so that it gives you proper time to prepare yourself versus saying a quick little intro in 2 seconds and then going right deep into the conversation. One of the things that I previously did was worked at a crisis line, and I was a supervisor for the crisis line, and I went out into the community and did suicide and crisis intervention and prevention workshops. Sometimes it was for an hour, sometimes it was 2-hour workshops, sometimes it was a 6-hour, and we even did 2 days. So there is a lot that I learned as a social worker, and, kind of going back a little bit, interestingly enough, crisis and suicide prevention work is not something that people in the mental health field are taught in depth. So another thing that we might talk about as well is the fact that not every social worker or mental health counselor or marriage and family therapist, they might not be trained to deal with crisis situations, even though sometimes that might be the expectation of, this is the reason why I go see a professional, is to get that mental health support. And so trying to give people in the mental health field a little bit of grace or patience, because again, they might need their own training to support people. But that can be difficult too, right? Like, you're trying to get help from a professional and it's like, they can't help you because they don't have training. And that's kind of one of those gaps in the system. So we talked about how my mom and I are going to talk about gaps and just try to start conversations where we can talk about these things, and maybe we don't find the answer. However, being able to talk about it might get us to that point. So do you have anything you'd like to add?
I think that, when you talk about clinicians or therapists being trained in suicide prevention and things like that, they are required as part of their license to do suicide trainings, over the course of renewing their license. And it's very different taking a training and then sitting with someone. So I just want to be able to recognize that, because it can be really uncomfortable for the person to share where they're at, and for the clinician or therapist to kind of help them work through it and be safe, in their space of the dark holes, which is what I call it personally, is a dark hole. And that they're not always necessarily trained in the way that, say, emergency room clinicians are, where they probably have more extensive training and supporting and crisis lines and things like that. So they have much more training in those areas than your probably everyday average clinician or therapist. So I just wanted to just share that piece, because sometimes it can be really uncomfortable for people to sit in that space, and and we want to make sure that we're supporting someone when they're feeling down and they're feeling depressed and they feel like life is so overwhelming that, hey, let me just go to bed and not wake up tomorrow, because that is so much more easier than having to figure out how I'm going to deal with all this stress in my life. So that was like kind of one thing that I wanted to, kind of bring up, because I've seen clinicians struggle with sitting with someone in crisis and, sending them off to someone else who's more trained in it. Though, if that person has a relationship with you, how do you support them versus sending them to someone they don't know to say, hey, yeah, let's just pass the buck and you deal with it. I think it can cause more distress for people at times. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important for not even clinicians, family and friends. Like, how do I support my loved one who's struggling? And, how do I know if they're safe? And so I think that this is more like information to share with just anyone in general, not necessarily the professionals, though it can be helpful, and being able to support one another when we're not in a good space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's I don't know, everything in life, and I think I've said this before, it's all nuanced, right? There is no magic wand, there's no magic pill. It doesn't make it go away. You don't go in therapy to, quote unquote, cure your depression or your anxiety or your trauma in one session. And I think it's the same way when you think about like suicide prevention and intervention. It's usually a bunch of things that happen over time, right? It's not just like, oh, this one thing happened and I don't want to be here anymore. Doing my work, working on the crisis line and, supervising the volunteers who answered the calls. And then when we were short volunteers, the staff would take the calls themselves. And so not only was I supervising the people, at times I was the one taking the calls. And people would call sometimes regularly, and it would be kind of like a similar issue. So if it was substance use related, sometimes their thoughts of not wanting to be here were specific to their substance use, because they would call us on other days and be sober, and they would never bring it up. So one of the things that people sometimes say is, as a support system, is calling the crisis line. I know nationally they now have 988, so it's an easier number to remember. And, people are trained, and this might be a side thing. However, I always find it interesting how they're called counselors, and they're not. Some crisis lines do have therapists and clinicians who answer the phones, and some have volunteers. Sometimes volunteers have clinicians supervising them, and sometimes people are almost 100% on their own. And I've talked with people who have worked or volunteered in different states where they were completely alone. And so they had to make the calls of when to call 911 and those next steps. So I really appreciated working on a crisis line where, as the clinicians, that was our responsibility to say if it needed that level of care, which is also difficult because even as the clinicians, it's like if someone says they're going to kill themselves and they hang up and they haven't really said anything other than that, there sometimes isn't necessarily a need to call 911. And that might sound counterintuitive for people listening, because you're like, they said they're going to kill themselves and they hung up the phone. And yet they didn't say if they had a plan. They didn't say if they had the firearm. Sometimes it's a test, and that's the hard part. Like, we don't know if they are going to do it. And if we call 911 and they go to the house and they talk with them, then that person might never call the crisis line again. So it's a very hard line to walk, because we want to make sure that when they call us that they can talk about those things versus reacting too quickly and then making them not want to engage in like supports and hopefully getting them to treatment or talking to someone in their life or getting additional support.
Right. So think about how challenging that is for a professional, and then for everyday people who come across this in their lives more frequently than they'd like, right? You know, I'm really worried about my kid, or I'm worried about my sibling, or my parent, or my grandparent, or a really close friend, you know, and, you know, determining how do I help them and what is the right decision, right? And so working in the field and working in community mental health, that was one of the biggest things. Like, clients would not disclose it because they would be saying, you're going to put me in the hospital. I don't want to be IE, which is an involuntary emergency admission. And maybe it's called different things in different states. I'm not sure. That's what it's called in the state of New Hampshire. And so, you know, it can be really scary to say to someone, I'm not doing good. I'm really struggling. Though I'm more afraid to tell you that because I'm afraid of what the reaction will be or the consequences, right? And so how do we kind of normalize some of that, right? For people in regards to not in a good space. I don't, you know, like they don't meet the level of care for hospitalization, and maybe they can create a plan with you to stay safe so that they don't need to go in there, right? And so until we start to make it safe for people to talk about their dark thoughts and feelings that they're experiencing, there's going to be that resistance, right? Because of the fear of, yeah, you're just going to put me in the hospital. I don't want to go there. And so, and I've said to multiple clients in my years of doing this, you will be the first person to know if I ever came to that decision. You are going to be the first person to know, and I'm going to support you through that process. I'm not going to just make the call and leave you high and dry, because I think supporting and navigating through that process, and because I have that relationship with that person, right? So being able to bridge that support and get them to that level of care that they need so that they can be safe and have a better experience with a hospitalization versus, you know, and then even while they're in the hospital, doing check-ins to say, hey, how are things going, you know, and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways we can do it versus, oh, so you have a plan to take your life? Oh, well, guess what? You're going in the hospital. Like, I don't think that needs to be our first response by anyone, professional or not. And so I think just normalizing those feelings and those thoughts, like, I'm a believer that most people go through that. At some point in their life, people feel down, they feel overwhelmed, they have a lot of stress going on, and it's a very natural response to stress. Like, oh my God, I just don't want to wake up tomorrow. Does it mean someone's going to take their life? No, they're just overwhelmed and stressed. And so talking through that to really kind of see, is there a plan? You know, do they have access and means and things like that? And that brings it to another level, right? Though there's a lot of things we can do before we even get there. And so what are some of those steps for the everyday person who really wants to be able to support a loved one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's again, nuanced. I think people have really bad experiences because, unfortunately, not every clinician like you has the ability to hold space for that, and they do call 911 or they get them admitted, because sometimes even just, again, saying it, depending on the state that you're in, you can get put into the hospital against your will. Oftentimes it's a 3-day treatment. You're in there for 3 days so they can watch you, and sometimes they're just babysitting you. As bad as that can sound to say to people listening, that's kind of the truth. I worked in Washington State. They called it an ITA, Involuntary Treatment Act. The only people in Washington State who can put someone in an ITA is a designated crisis responder. So even if, they go to the hospital still has to call to speak with a DCR, and the DCR is then the person who does the, quote unquote investigation. So they'll talk with the person, they'll talk with family members, they'll talk with the professionals, they kind of talk with everyone, because they take it seriously, where they don't want to put someone in the hospital if they're not, if they don't, quote unquote meet the criteria in the professional terms. And, again, the flip side is that people have been put in hospitals against their will, and they got babysat, so they didn't get any treatment. They get a list. We've talked about this before. You get a list of therapists, call them, good luck. And what was the third one? And sometimes people go into treatment and they have the worst experience because people who are in there might have, not that their trauma is more or worse, however, they get exposed to that trauma, and because of that exposure, then their situation gets worse, because then they're, more overwhelmed, and they're like, what the hell, I'm here to get help. And again, not to say that everyone else who's in treatment doesn't need it or something like that, versus how the system, even though it's there to help, can make people's healing take longer, or it causes more harm. And it's again, what do you do when you're trying to get help and you don't get help, or you get worse because of how the system is, or, again, getting put in against your will? Because if you think about doctors or other professions who kind of similar, they have usually a 3-hour training that they have to take depending on what the profession is. And if you take that every 2 or 3 years, again, if you don't work in having these conversations somehow built into regular treatment or regular surveys that you have, so that it's so that there's more comfortability talking about it. Because that's why people don't like talking about it, because they don't talk about it. And so they ask it really quick, and then they put you in the hospital because they're like, oh, yeah, but you said yes. You have to go. I'm not a therapist. I'm just a doctor. I'm just going to put you in the hospital. I'm going to call 911.
Well, right. And it's even, so when patients go see their primary care provider and, they do the PHQ-9, which is the depression scale. And one of the questions on there is, have you had any thoughts of hurting yourself or not wanting to be here? And, and people say, yes, some days, half days, or most days, right? So whatever option, if you pick more than none, it kind of flags that questionnaire, right? So again, it provides an opportunity to have a conversation, right? Versus you need to go to the ER and be evaluated. So that our first response shouldn't be, let's throw you into the next level of care or pass the buck. How do I have a conversation with the person sitting in front of me to really see kind of what's going on? And that happened this week with a patient for me who came in for short-term therapy, graduated from it, went off, and then was experiencing these feelings of, I don't want to be here, I have a lot of medications, and those thoughts and feelings really scared the patient. and requested to come back in and see me. And so we had a really good conversation this week, and we really talked in depth about, what the feelings were, what the thoughts were, what options there are, like doing some safety planning, exploring supports. And I really highlighted the strength that it took to reach out, right? Because I think it's important to recognize that so that people feel like I'm not going to be penalized if I reach out for help, right? I'm going to be supported. And that's what people are looking for. They just want to feel supported in some of the darkest times in their life. And yes, some people do require a higher level of care, and not everyone. So I think teasing out the conversation, like having the conversation, being transparent, and normalizing that life can be stressful really can go a long way in people, being able to problem solve, right, if you will, around, okay, so yeah, I didn't feel like that every day. I felt it this one day, and this is what's going on. Okay, so how do we manage those things when they come up so that you don't go down the dark hole? You just might like teeter on the edge of it, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's really helpful for people to just be present. And it's not easy to sit with someone who's struggling. And, and we've all had it, professional or not. We've sat with a friend or a family member or whatever, and we've sat through some tough times with people. And, I think one of the big things is to remember is you're not there to fix it. We don't fix these things. We help people manage it, right? Whether you're in a professional setting or whether you're sitting with a friend. And, how do I support, I think is the question. And what would be some good questions, Stephen, that someone could ask if they were sitting with a friend or a loved one to kind of help them see where they're at?
Yeah, I think one of the tools that I used when I did workshops is the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, and it's a C-SSRS. I hope I said that right. There's so many acronyms.
I know, I think it's
C-SSRS, Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, so C-SSRS.
Yes.
They do have, when you look for it, if you want to they have a free training. However, they do have different questions depending. So there's like a general public one, and then there's a more in-depth triage one that an ER might use. And so when you look at it, it might be difficult to navigate, but that's something that we can kind of talk about or help navigate if anyone's interested in that. Again, leave comments, let us know. However, the first question will ask more of, like I said earlier, like a euphemism, something that might not seem like they might be just overwhelmed. And so, if you catch them saying, like, I don't want to be here anymore, you can ask them, what does that mean when you say that? Just to leave it open-ended, and it allows them to either share or not. Like, you don't want to force them, and I think that's the hard part, because we want to fix, and we could be like, no, there's something wrong with you. Like, I know there's something wrong with you. You need to tell me. Like, tell me now. And right. It's like, yeah, and I think that is also a reaction, because you might love or care about someone that you want to support them or take away their pain. And I think that's a valid thing that we do as like a community, is how we support each other. And then also understanding, like, are we reacting to something or are we responding to it, right? So if we feel something in ourselves that kind of makes us want to jump to fixing or making it go away, versus telling them things like, I love you, I'm just really concerned. It seems that you've been down more often, or I've noticed that we don't hang out as much, and just letting them know those little things, because sometimes people get stuck either in depression or they just get stuck in their own pain or their trauma that they don't think anyone cares. And more times than not, I want to say that people do notice it, and sometimes they don't say anything because they might know more of the details of like the work struggles or the family struggles or the friend struggles or the relationship struggles. And so that's why I think the C-SSRS kind of allows you to ask, have you thought about not wanting to be here anymore? Or do you wish that you could go to sleep and not wake up? And so that talks to more of someone's passive thoughts of suicide. The second question gets more in-depth, and so it asks you be more direct. Like, have you thought about killing yourself? Another term that you could use is unaliving, which is a newer term. So you can just ask them if they're thinking about unaliving themselves, but depending on where they are, they might be confused and be like, what the hell are you talking about? And I think the first two phrases, they're scary for a person to ask because you don't want to know the answer. Like, let's just be real. Like, if they say yes, then you're like, WTF? Like, what do I'm overwhelmed now because like, I want to ask you this, but like, and I know the answer, but so it gets tricky, and I know it's never easy. And even if you only get to that first question of saying like, do you wish, you don't want to be here anymore, or you could sleep and never wake up. So I think that at least opens the door and allows them to understand that you notice the differences or the changes and you want to support them. And even if you say, well, if it gets worse, and the second question could be after that is, have you ever have thoughts about acting on not wanting to be here? And I know that's more subtle. I know when I did training and workshops that we would say like, be direct, and you want to be direct too, but again, like if you want them to open up, it's, again, it's nuanced. So it's like, as long as you're asking questions, I think that helps, right? Like, well, I noticed like all of these things in your life are like overwhelming you. Is there anything that I can do to help? Clean, drive you to places, go with you to place like, doctor appointments, whatever it might be. It's going to be different for everyone, but little things that you can do so that they feel that they have more support, right?
And I think that that's the piece, right? So if therapists feel uncomfortable sometimes doing these rating scales, imagine the everyday person who doesn't work in the field and they're like, I'm sitting with this person. So I think, asking open-ended questions is better because it allows for them to elaborate. It allows for someone to share more of what they're experiencing and, can give you information on how to best support them, right? And so if it starts to get too uncomfortable, so if you ask that question, are you having any thoughts of killing yourself? Or do you have any plans of killing yourself? How can I support you? Do you think it might be helpful if we go and talk to someone? And I can go with you if that's comfortable for you. So I think it's normalizing it and providing support without fixing. Mm-hmm. So I think when we try to get into the fixing, it shuts down. People just shut down from it because where that individual is at in that moment is they see no light, they see no hope, right? And so you're trying to fix something and they're like, I can't even fix it. How the heck do you think you're going to fix it? It's kind of that battle that occurs. So I think asking the open-ended questions and versus like, so are you feeling okay? Yes or no. Mm-hmm. That's it. That's all. The only information you're going to get on a closed question, right? If you ask an open-ended question, so can you tell me a little bit about how you're feeling? Now it kind of opens up into a conversation, which they're going to share a little bit more. Well, I've been feeling down for the last few months. I'm not getting out of bed like I used to. I stay in bed longer every day, or I'm not eating as much, or my sleep is bad. Like whatever it is that's going on. So it can provide you with a lot of information. So if someone's saying, I'm sleeping 20 hours a day, that's a problem. They're not functioning, right? And so it's just more information. So the open-ended questions allows us to gather more information and have a better understanding, hopefully, of how to best support that person.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's, again, the nuance of it is that everyone is at a different place. So I wouldn't say it's difficult to kind of tell people what to say, although it's difficult to tell them what to say because we don't know their situation. And so someone might be more, as they say, passive in their thoughts, and they might not have ever had a thought of killing themselves, but they've thought about not being here anymore or going to sleep and not waking up, right? Like that's like probably like the lowest level of not needing like a ton of treatment or support or therapy. It might just be, again, help with their life, or maybe they hate their job, or they're in a bad relationship. Again, there's a lot of factors. There generally isn't one thing that like happens to a person, right? Because if we go down that rabbit hole of all the traumas that have happened, there are like, I don't know, a million times more trauma things that have happened than people who have, died by suicide. And not to say that I'm taking it lightly, it's just there's been a lot of bad, horrible things, and people are still here. So I think the nuance of it is, trying to get training, or again, talk to people. Like even if you're worried about someone, you can call the crisis line and they can help you with things to say. There's, again, the free training for the C-SSRS. And I think that's kind of one of the better ones. I'm sure there's a lot out there. Again, that I might have a little bias because that's what I was trained and used for the workshops that I did. And it's 6 questions. I would say 1, 2, and 6 are really important. Again, the first one would be asking someone if they wanted to sleep and not wake up, or if they just don't want to be here anymore. The second one asks more specifically, have you had actual thoughts of killing yourself or suicide? And then the 6th question asks a person if they've been collecting or like buying the means. So like if someone doesn't want to be here, but they're not thinking about killing themselves, but they bought a gun, or if they bought rope and they don't plan on whatever you might need rope for.
Right, or they're stockpiling medication.
Yep.
Which is a big one.
And so those are things, because I think what happens is that when people don't want to be here anymore, or they say that, and it gets dismissed, but they're doing something that indicates something else, like they're quote unquote preparing for it. Even, again, they're not necessarily consciously thinking about preparing for it. It's just, I'm going to do this just in case. And although we can say there are a lot of things that you do just in case to prevent things, I would say this is one of the things that you don't want to do just in case.
Right.
And so having a conversation with that person, and that's the hard part too, like, not that people are fake, but we fake a lot. Like you said, how are you doing? Oh, I'm good. I'm fine. Things are great. Like masking it, or not being vulnerable, or, men don't talk about their feelings, or just all these, gender norms and things we're taught in society to do or not to do. Reaching out for help is weak. And we keep talking about these things, but it's a continual problem. Like it's still seen as weak to some people to reach out for help. And it's, reinforced, right? And so like, right? Again, the nuance, like how do we fix that problem and tell people it's okay to reach out for help? And when people have negative experiences, calling the crisis line. People have had really bad experiences calling the crisis line. And again, people aren't perfect, and they make mistakes, and that comes with getting the feedback and getting trained more, or again, not everyone gets supervised by clinicians. So they're kind of like, not that they're willy-nilly, because I would assume that all crisis line workers have some form of training and they have some form of support. I know a friend who worked on the crisis text line, And she was like, yeah, I had a supervisor that I could talk to or text, but like, again, like, how do you facilitate texting someone in crisis and then like texting a supervisor being like, oh, hey, what do I do with this? Do I call 911 or do I not? Or do I like, how do you balance that? So yeah, so it's a very nuanced conversation to have. And I wish there was an easy answer to give people, but I feel like I won't say that because thinking in my head, it's not a good thing to say. But I don't want to make people feel like, oh, now I have more questions. Like, I want you to have more questions because the more curious you can be about something and trying to better understand it will help you be able to have these conversations with the people in your life.
Right, exactly. And, and so I think, some of the resources that we talked about is, they have the 988 number now, and that's for a mental health crisis, just like 911 for usually like medical emergencies and things like that. So they have the 988. And I know at least in the state of New Hampshire, we have our own 800 number that's specific just to the state of New Hampshire. Which is generally the number that I give to patients or I give to clients because it's within the state and they can, send out a mobile crisis unit that's, within the state and not someone that might be in California or in Florida and things like that. Though I think that having any resources is really helpful. And there's also NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. And, it's a great resource, too, to look up trainings and things like that. And I do believe each state might have their own emergency response for people in crisis as well. So, I think it's helpful for all of us to educate ourselves because this isn't everyone's life. This doesn't just happen in the movies. This is real, and it happens to our loved ones. It can happen to ourselves at times. And so being able to get the support that we need instead of trying to find people to fix it or be reactive and go down a path that can be more harmful and detrimental. And so, so I think that just being able to recognize signs and offer support to the best of your ability, not everyone is open to it. And maybe that means you get someone else involved that might be closer to that person. Again, it's just observing, recognizing, and extending a hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know there's, again, all places are different. And if you're in a rural area, you might have nothing, which, it sucks to say that because you want people to have support. Unfortunately, not everyone has it. Working on the crisis line in Washington State, originally it was just for one county. And then it's an unfortunate event, but great opportunity to expand. During the pandemic, they were supporting 8 additional counties. So it was interesting to see the differences between all 9 of them, because 3 of them have mobile crisis units or mobile crisis teams to go out into the community. But the other 5, and I would assume most of the others don't. So there are also the designated crisis responders. And unfortunately, sometimes in certain counties, they are not all created equal. And so sometimes they only respond when a hospital or law enforcement calls for them. So if it's a public, a regular community member, then they don't get sent out. So, I just want to acknowledge, the the nuance of people not having access to those resources and kind of reinforce why it might be important to reach out to places like NAMI, because the National Alliance for Mental Illness, it's a nationwide organization, and they have their own support line and maybe even crisis line. There's the Trevor Project and the Trans Lifeline. The Trevor Project is more for young adults and youth for coming out, or again, their own crisis line that is specific for people within the LGBTQ plus community. And then the Trans Lifeline is more specific to more those who might be gender nonconforming, trans, non-binary, agender, and it is, I know for them, they're specifically staffed by volunteers who also identify within either of the gender or no gender for that support. And it is really about finding resources that are specific to your needs. And I think that can be a difficult thing to do sometimes if you don't have that support, or if you're one person who is supporting that person. So if you're supporting someone, then I think it's, one of the best things that you can do is try to find support for them, which is difficult, but finding ways to find support for them can also find ways to support you as well, of calling the lines and the numbers and saying, hey, I have this friend or family member, and I just want to know what my options are or what supports are available. And then if you can, trying to grow their support network so that you're not the only one supporting that person. And if not, then what supports can you get for yourself so that you don't have to carry that heavy mental load on your own?
Right. Yeah. Because, it's such a cliche saying, though very true, right? It takes a village, right? And so there's a lot of support out there. Sometimes we talk about, gaps in our systems and things like that we all know that is prevalent in our systems. And to be able to, just reach out and have an understanding of what's available. And, even if it's not in a rural area, what's in the vicinity outside of your rural area, to be able to find that support. And there's a lot of national organizations too that provide support across the nation that can help regardless of where you're at. And even if you're in a larger city where you have a lot of resources, they might not have something specific to what you're looking for. And, and you can always reach out to, a professional in the field and just say, hey, I've been really struggling with trying to find, do you know of any resources, and just network with the people in your community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think the last resource that I'll share for now, and we'll plug a different podcast, it is the Feeling Good podcast by Dr. David Burns. He created Team CBT. So he focuses on cognitive behavioral therapy practices in the team model. So there's testing, empathy, assessment, and measuring, because he believes in data to prove or to show outcomes of whether or not, more in the therapy setting, if it's working. And so a therapist would provide short surveys in the beginning, in the end. And so the podcast is more open. So it is for any therapist or clinician who might be interested in learning more about the model. And it is also helpful for the general public because he talks about what he calls, cognitive distortions, the big fancy word for, negative thoughts. And so he helps people over the last 30 plus years. He's 80 now, in his 80s. He doesn't practice, but he does the podcast and he does a lot of workshops for professionals who want to get trained in it. And it might be a good way because it's free, and it might not necessarily work for you. However, again, I think what we talked about the last episode or two ago is finding something that works for you. And again, that could be difficult because you're like, I'm trying, and nothing is working. I think sometimes taking a break is helpful too. If you realize that things aren't working, sometimes it's okay just to let it go for the moment and say, I'm just going to focus on what I can control, and it seems like this isn't working right now, and you can always come back. I mean, it's not going, your problems aren't going anywhere, so you might as well do what you can and live life if you can. Again, nuance of how difficult that is if someone's in depression or a fear of going outside. Obviously, how can you challenge yourself a little bit, step by step. It doesn't have to be big things. Again, little things. So going out for 5 minutes a day, depending on, again, your situation might be different. So just how can you push yourself a little bit? Because oftentimes I like to say growth happens through discomfort. And so if you're always in that little like comfortable place where it's like, I'm just going to stay in by myself and not make friends or like not reach out or do these things, you kind of get in that bad habit of secluding yourself versus, okay, I know that this isn't helping me, and what can I do to kind of push myself to create these support systems?
Right. Yeah. Because it's very easy to fall into those traps, right? You get into these spaces and then you get stuck there, and then you don't even know how you got there, and you don't know how to get out of it. And so you feel like that's what life is, right? We live what we learn. So when we start to learn new things, even though you talk about those small steps allow for relearning, and getting your body back into a different space, and your mind and your thoughts, right? Because as we move in whatever direction in our life, there's new feelings, there's new emotions, there's new thoughts, right? Because we're moving out of the space that we were in. And so, so it is easy to stay in the unhealthy, comfortable place because that's what you know. And it's fearful of what's on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we know that this episode is a little longer than usual, and we don't normally set a time limit, and I think this is a conversation that requires more time, even more time than what this is. And so again, if you have any comments, or if you can't find the C-SSRS training, or you can't find, I'm sure you can find the Feeling Good podcast by Dr. David Burns. However, any questions or comments that you have, please let us know, because we want to make sure that we can continue conversations where people might have questions or might need additional support. And yeah, I guess that's it for now. Take care.